So now it is my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today, His Excellency Andres Valenciano, the Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. Minister Valenciano has been instrumental in building a model, and a very successful model, for attracting sustainable investments to Costa Rica, and more recently also for achieving Costa Rica's accession to the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So I'm very proud to have Minister Valenciano here with us today, not only because we have many friends from all over Latin America with us, but I firmly believe that Costa Rica can serve as a role model to others, and that in many different ways. So first, we will hear from the minister, then we will have a conversation followed by a Q&A from all of you. So please field your questions in the Q&A, and at the end, we'll also have a brief poll. So again, please give us your feedback there as well. So Minister, welcome, pura vida, and good to see you again as well.
Oh, hello, everyone. Dear Robin, it's a pleasure to be back in contact with you, and thank you very much, and congratulations to WTCA for organizing this event and bringing together people from all over the world to discuss key issues such as sustainability, trade, investment, and global trends that are shaping the jobs that we do and the world that we live in. So it's a pleasure to be here speaking with you all.
Well, thank you. Pleasure is all ours. And as we indeed have a large audience here today from all over the world, very eager to hear your story and the story of Costa Rica's success. So please, Minister, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Robin. Once again, I will try to be brief and provide a general overview of how sustainability has shaped our country's history, and it will definitely shape our country's future. And obviously, I'll mention how that has been integrated into our trade agenda. Hopefully, this will, as Robin rightly pointed out, in that sense, Costa Rica has always tried to serve as an example, to try to lead by example, because, as you know, Costa Rica is a small country, but we are very ambitious in terms of our sustainability objectives, and how that definitely shapes the way that we understand public policy and our vision for overall development in our country. So throughout history, Costa Rica has seen that economic growth and sustainability go hand in hand. And so both economic and environmental policies must be aligned. And we see this more and more throughout the world, as financial markets, investors, consumer demands are moving sustainability from a nice to have to a real necessity. And in that sense, we are seeing the benefits of being ahead of the curve, of being very, very proactive in making sure we're able to tell the world how we see sustainability as an engine of growth, as an engine of prosperity. But this didn't happen overnight. Costa Rica, since many decades ago, made some very critical decisions in its history in terms of policy making, when it back over 100 years ago already declared education to be free and mandatory for everyone. Then at the beginning of last century, a lot of decisions were being made to make sure that we had universal health care. We abolished the army, so Costa Rica doesn't have a standing army for over almost 70 years now. And that means that policymakers back then understood that the building blocks of society were to be made around the well-being of people. Education, healthcare, like I mentioned, not using resources to invest on an army. And then more and more, as we begin to understand our connection between human well-being and nature, a lot of conservation efforts start being discussed in the country. And Costa Rica is now one of the few countries in the world to actually have been able to reverse deforestation, to stop biodiversity loss, and actually increase forest coverage now over to half of our territory, while at the same time increasing economic growth. And by having, and I'm telling all this backstory. So when I will mention a couple of examples of how now sustainability is driving our foreign direct investment strategies, how sustainability is driving our export promotions, and how sustainability is at the core of the trade agreements that we are negotiating. This happened because of this long-standing investments on healthcare, on education, on conservation, that basically allowed our country to make the case that our talent, our people, and quality of life were to be our main presentation cards, and that were going to be the driving efforts. So when companies are looking to invest around the world, they look to Costa Rica because we now have able to provide electricity that is 99% coming from renewable sources. So that means that when companies are looking where to invest around the world, they'll say, well, Costa Rica has this type of policies that will allow us as a company to achieve our own internal objectives when it comes to making sure that we are able to say we are committed to the environment and to the ambitious climate agenda. But again, building an electricity matrix that is able to allow companies to produce their goods and their services with renewable energy, again, didn't happen overnight. So in that sense, the alignment that, like I've been saying, between the trade and the environmental is a state policy matter for Costa Rica and has been doing so for many, many years now. And it is expected that our trade agenda actually supports the decarbonization plan that Costa Rica has, and at the same time, the opportunities brought about by decarbonizing our economy will spill over to other dimensions of well-being and development, like I've been mentioning, around trade, innovation, productivity, and competitiveness. And we're actually working very closely with our colleagues from the environmental sector to make sure that this can continue leading Costa Rica on a win-win situation. That means if we continue promoting the greening of supply chains, reducing emissions, adopting circular economy principles, we are envisioning that this will put us, like I mentioned, ahead of the curve. And as we can say, early adopters of this trend, we are now seeing the benefits of doing so. So this has not only been aspirational for us, we have been doing concrete initiatives that allow us to showcase how the trade policy can deliver on sustainability, and sustainability can deliver on trade impact. And I'm just going to mention a couple of examples to make my case. For example, now we have an initiative, our export promotion agency called the Green Growth Platform. And this is a program that provides seed capital to SMEs, small, medium enterprises, so they can be able to adopt environmental certifications and innovations in areas such as energy efficiency, carbon emissions reductions, waste and water management. And now companies who have gone through that program not only improve their productivity, but they also increase their exports and reduce their CO2 emissions. So they become more competitive in terms of the global markets, but at the same time, they'll help Costa Rica achieve its climate goals. Also, as part of our strategies, not only making sure that our exporters understand and are able to jump on that bandwagon of sustainability, so they can compete on global markets because of the rising demands by consumers, to making sure that they want to understand what is the carbon footprint of this good, of these services that I'm buying. But also, it has helped us shape our proposal of how to attract foreign direct investment to Costa Rica. We have been using what we call a triple P approach of people, planet, and prosperity to attract companies that recognize sustainability as a key aspect of their own business model. And more multinational corporations express their interest in investing in Costa Rica precisely because of the commitments in sustainability. And just a couple of examples. One is a couple of months ago, the pharmaceutical company Bayer announced a $200 million investment in Costa Rica to establish a state-of-the-art pharmaceutical facility. And in their communications and in PR, they explicitly mentioned that Costa Rica's commitment to sustainability aligns with their own goals, and this was a driver behind their investment decision to put that facility in Costa Rica. And on the same month, and this is a completely different sector, but it's just an example of how sustainability is driving decisions for all type of businesses. But as you may have heard, a very well-known British rock band called Coldplay announced that they will open the new world tour starting next year, and they will open the tour in Costa Rica because Costa Rica produces, like I mentioned, 99% of our electricity from renewable sources. So it contributes to their own commitment to making their global music tour as environmentally as friendly as possible. And just another example of how we're using sustainability as part of our trade agenda. We understand it has to be integrated into the negotiations of that we're having with our commercial partners and with countries around the world. So, for example, Costa Rica right now is part of the ACCTS, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability. And this agreement is part of we are part of a group of small but like-minded countries, which include New Zealand, Switzerland, Fiji, Norway, Iceland, and Costa Rica, in which we're working towards liberalizing trade of environmental goods. We are enlarging the list of environmental services. We are promoting good practices around eco-labeling and setting commitments on how to phase out harmful fossil fuels. And this might seem like a very ambitious agreement, and it is, because we believe that this is the ACCTS can be a good example of how regional trade agreements can promote mutual benefits for trade and environment, and it can help lead the agenda around multilateral negotiations that are being discussed at the World Trade Organization or bilaterally between other countries around the world. They can take notice of what is happening around agreements such as the ACCTS. And obviously, all that I've been discussing, at the end of the day, what we want is for trade to be a driver for not only the environmental goals that I've been mentioning, but also for the overall well-being of our population. We want to make sure that companies who come to Costa Rica invest in a way that provides jobs, that helps us provide good quality of life for people. And we want companies to invest in Costa Rica and their executives who are relocated to our country to say, well, we're not only complying with KPIs around sustainability, we also get to live in a country that it's making its efforts to provide good quality of life to its citizens. Everything from the health policy that I mentioned that we can discuss further, or education or around conservation, because we understand that it has value for people being around nature and being around protected areas because of air quality of life. Air quality, which translates to having good quality of life when people have access to nature. So we understand that we can provide not only a positive business environment, but also offering other things that make life meaningful can be drivers for decisions, not only as you can imagine, for tourists who have a long-standing tradition of picking countries like Costa Rica because of nature and conservation, but now more and more business or digital nomads, entrepreneurs who are looking for places to work around the world that can inspire them on how to come up with their social business, or social entrepreneurs who are looking to solve global challenges through the private sector, can be inspired by a small country like Costa Rica, which has been, which we are very proud to say we've been very ambitious, even though we're a small country, to provide that there is a business case to be made around sustainability, around well-being, around this commitment to society in general, and making sure that we are hopefully merging climate action with economic growth, and making sure that this is not only a very strategic way of generating jobs, it's also helps us increase productivity and drive economic development. It's also a moral imperative that we have of our time to make sure that we work with others for positive climate action. So I'll stop there, and I'll be more than happy to go back and forth with Robin with any additional points that you want us to discuss.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is really impressive, and it really fascinates me, because you actually closed by saying there's also a moral imperative. And I know in our network here around the world, many, if not all of our World Trade Centers, our members are very focused also on the sustainability question, but it also always comes down to what exactly does that mean. And from your story, this is really sustainability is a lifestyle, and it is centered around, which I truly think is so exceptional, around focusing on the well-being of people as a nation. This is not happening at the individual or the company level. No, this is happening in the country as a nation, and obviously carrying a lot of support, because you're also not in an easy neighborhood, let me put it this way. And then so you still create this beacon of stability, of creating political stability. So there is, for those reasons, also so many lessons to learn from your concept, because you've been doing it and it does work. That's the thing. The proof of the pudding here is really in the eating. So you also moved as an economy from more like an exporter of let's say raw materials, so from coffee, from agriculture products, into, you just mentioned, bringing in Coldplay to kick off its world tour, and a $200 million investment of a corporation like Bayer, who I'm sure the competition is very fierce to get those types of investments. So maybe the question would be, just for us to understand, like when we talked about trade deals, and the multilateral framework is a little bit all over the place, and I know you're working hard on trying to, within the WTO context, to salvage the fishing question. But when we look more at bilateral or regional trade agreements, you said sustainability is part of how we approach those negotiations. Like, give us a bit of an insight at the government level. You're around the table, you're discussing a trade deal, and feel free to bring up an example with the country that you've done it with. Like, how do you inject that sustainability component in a trade agreement? Like, how exactly does this work?
Yeah, excellent. No, that's a great question, Robin. Like you mentioned, Costa Rica, if you go back 3 decades, and that's very recent history, Costa Rica was a main exporter of agricultural goods, basic agricultural goods, right? And I'm talking about a dozen of them. And that's it. Now, our main export is medical devices. That's our #1 export. And almost half of the exports of Costa Rica come from services. Obviously, that has a big component in tourism, but even if you take out tourism, you'll see how shared services, financial, human resources, logistics, more and more high value added services for tech-based companies is taking a larger role in our export matrix. But in order to do that, we have been, even though, like you said, we're a small country, we have free trade agreements, which basically cover more than 2/3 of the global GDP. So that means we have global trade agreements with the European Union, with United States, with China, with Singapore, Korea, with Mexico, with Chile, right? So all around the world. And more, what we've been seeing is, like, for example, the ACCTS agreement that I mentioned. This is an agreement that is basically driven to pursue how do countries exchange goods that comply with environmental standards, and how we reduce all types of barriers for those goods to move freely between the economies. And at the other side of the spectrum, we try to, how do we make it more costly for goods or services that don't comply with environmental standards to be traded. So that means for all the barriers for trade that people can imagine, how to move around a good that says, for example, well, if you're growing your bananas and you're doing it in a way that it's carbon neutral or water neutral, then how does that good get a preferential access to a market in another country, right? Because, and this is not only because of an interest of governments, like you're saying, it's because more and more consumers, very sophisticated consumers, more and more in markets in the US, in Europe, in Asia, and everywhere, are going to pick, if they have options, or say, well, I wanna know how is that banana? And you can pick an example of any good. I'm picking a very simple one around agriculture because of how it relates to climate and how vulnerable it is to climate change at the same time, and how much it can contribute, right? So when people are saying, well, if I'm going to buy a banana and it says that it's carbon neutral and it has the certification and it's water neutral, and it also being done, it's compliance with labor rights, well, I'd rather do that and maybe even pay a premium for that, because I'm willing to make sure that my dollar is going to, or my euro or my yen is going to the buying and the promoting of goods that have that in mind. So we try to make sure that our trade agreements now and the discussions that we're having with other countries, when we are updating trade agreements that were negotiated 20 years ago, now incorporate those variables. Now are saying, well, maybe 20 years ago we weren't discussing this as proactively as we are now, but if we are going to modernize or update our trade agreements to include things around e-commerce or the digital economy, well, we also have to think about sustainability. And that's the type of discussions that we've been having around the world.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating that you're basically saying we're going to create a subsection of free flow of goods based on the sustainability of the goods in question, actually. So this is very interesting. So we have many of our World Trade Centers around the world, as you may know. So our World Trade Centers, our licenses are based on a city basis. So they never represent a country, but many of them are also involved with foreign direct investment promotion of their cities, their regions, their states. So this is a very interesting, I think, for them to listen to your story on how they can also contribute to that sustainability question. And I would like to quickly sidestep here to the team in New York. We're going to do a poll at the end of our session. I would like to add, team, if you can, add a question to the poll, which is, because I've been having a conversation with certain companies to see, should we also introduce our own sustainability matrix, if you like, for our World Trade Centers, or make it available to the companies to the business partners that they work with. So question for the poll would be, would you support introducing a sustainability measurement tool for World Trade Center members and business partners, just as a question out there. So see if we can bring that in the poll. It would be interesting to see what comes out of that. So another question that came in also here in the Q&A already, and I want to tie that to the fighting deforestation question. You in Costa Rica put in place I believe the payments for environmental services program, where you actively, right, basically pay farmers not to cut the forest. And so the question from the audience here is, during this transition from a more agriculture base material exporter to where you are now, higher finished goods, investing so much in education, how were you able to afford that transition from an economical perspective? Like how could you survive this transition?
Well, it has been, the business case has been there all along. Like you mentioned, Costa Rica just got awarded or recognized by the Earthshot Prize by the government in the UK, precisely because of that payment for environmental services, like you mentioned. It pays, it basically a governmental program started many decades ago, that we would pay everyone from indigenous populations to private owned land to conserve their forests, to conserve land. And we saw this because, for example, at that moment, and it's still so, tourism continues to be a driving force behind our economic growth. And we understood that many years ago, and this was, again, visionary people said, well, if we're gonna showcase the world how Costa Rica has these green areas and volcanoes and beaches and forests, we might as well pay to protect them. And actually that has paid off, like I mentioned, not only because of tourism, but then because there's a lot of other industries that now more and more understand that there's value in that. And there's value in having companies, when they're looking to invest around the world, they want to make sure that when they're pushing their corporate social responsibility programs, they have a lot of options to do that in a place like Costa Rica, because they can quickly align themselves to the efforts of conservation that are already happening on the ground, on the communities around them, where their own staff, where their own people are living. And it makes this synergy. So if, at that moment, people might have thought, well, if you're going to start, conservation of forests and all that, does that going to slow down economic growth? No, it actually helps support the rise of tourism, of high value added services, of driving investments, of providing also people on the ground, especially around agriculture, like I mentioned, to be able to say, well, if we do this in a way, everything from raising cattle to exporting bananas or coffee in a way that it's in balance with nature, that's value added. People will pay for it, and it has actually paid off. So the economic transition then, when we went from basic agriculture service goods to high-tech medical devices and financial shared services, it actually has been a sophistication and a strategy on how to diversify our exports, because we realized we couldn't depend on one commodity. That makes us very vulnerable. So export diversification actually has allowed us to be very resilient. And during the past year with the pandemic, actually exports in Costa Rica have increased. Even in 2020, we had a positive number of in terms of exports, precisely because of how diversified our export matrix is. But again, everything has been done in a way that is very consistent with the climate agenda, and it actually has paid off.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And sort of what also always intrigues me as well is when we did our General Assembly back in April, one of our guests was Professor Rigobon from MIT Sloan, who talked to us about measuring and measurement, and how we tend to measure all the wrong things. We measure a whole bunch of metrics, but by the time we have the numbers, they're a year outdated. But there's also a thing like measuring happiness. And some countries, and I know it happens, of course, also in Costa Rica, measure the happiness of its people, and Costa Rica always scores very high. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that measuring of happiness and all the things that you just talked about. This focus on well-being of people, on the environmental footprint, on sustainability. Obviously, you need large popular support on an ongoing basis to carry on these policies. So what are the hurdles? Because I would imagine many of those decisions are not easy decisions, right? You sometimes have to go down the mountain a little bit before you can climb again. So how did you politically navigate those making those tough decisions that sometimes may not yield a benefit tomorrow or next month, but are really investments in the future? So can you speak to that a little bit, like those hurdles and how you overcame those?
Absolutely, and we are actually having a political discussion right now around how to expand this idea of conserving the land. But now Costa Rica is basically 97% water when we think about our water coverage, because of we have a Cocos Island, which is an island that basically makes Costa Rica water coverage way bigger than our land coverage in terms of size.
Mhm.
We are now thinking, how does this payment for environmental services translate to the ocean? Because, and this is a very complex discussion, because there's a lot of livelihoods that depend on fishing, and fisheries depend, and I mean small fisheries, small and medium companies, and people who are, individual boat owners who depend on their livelihoods for fishing in those areas. So if we're going to have a conversation around conservation of those areas, we do have to run the numbers, and we have been doing this for the past year and a half, understanding if we say we're going to declare and we're going to actually expand the area that covers the national park around Cocos Island, what does that mean for the livelihood of people who are fishing there?
Yeah.
And like you said, these are trade-offs that you have to take into account. But what we've seen, and all the scientific studies that were done around this idea, so to be able to translate it into actual policy and practice, has said that by actually implementing that, expanding the area that covers the conservation area around this island, it will allow for the regrowth and reproduction of species that are highly valuable to the fishing market. So, and this will not only have an impact on fishing, but also it would allow us to not only continue driving more tourists, but also to research and investigations and scientific research that can be done around Cocos Island and this national park. So then you have scientific expeditions, you have tourism, and you have a higher growth and reproduction of fishes that are very valuable for the livelihood of the local fisheries that depend on them. But again, this is you have to take a wholesome approach to these kind of policies. You can't just take the angle of conservation. You can't just take the economic side of it. And that goes back to measurement. What is it that you want to measure? Well, at the end of the day, you have to take into account a lot of variables into your assessment to make sure that you're understanding, well, how does this impact the economic activities, tourism, science research, and how do you put a price on that? It's not as simple. And I think the measurement question as we move forward in society, trying to move forward just beyond the simple GDP measurements and economic growth into more, how do you translate the value of conservation of nature in terms of what does that allow for potential scientific discoveries, and obviously for tourism and the well-being of people who depend on fisheries. So it's a lot of things that you have to measure and take into account when making these political decisions that you rightly point out, Robin. And we are having that discussion right now as we want to expand our conservation efforts from the land to the sea, because at the end of the day, there has to be an effort around the world on understanding the role that oceans play into the climate agenda.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I see some comments here in the chat also about the importance of the blue economy. But sort of what you're referring to is really goes back to the basics of involving all stakeholders in decision making. It's more known, this type of language when you talk about at the corporate level, who are stakeholders, as shareholders, as customers, as employees. But actually to do this as a government, right, where it's not, as you said, it's either conservation or economic. It can actually be both, and what's the best, not the lowest common denominator here, but what's the best solution for both. So another question, maybe to turn things a little bit upside down, the sustainability question, like you're obviously growing, right? There's limitations. So how sustainable is the growth that you're pursuing? And is there an endpoint? Is there a point where you say this is where our happiness is where it needs to be, and any incremental growth is actually going to be counterproductive for our well-being or model of well-being?
That's a fascinating question. And I think just as we, like the last couple of weeks, we saw the COP26, this gathering of parties of countries around the world discussing the climate ambition and sustainability. I think there's so many angles that need to be taken into account to be able to answer that. For on one end, we need that climate ambition on part of governments to say, well, we are going to commit ourselves to make sure that we reduce the emissions that all our economy, all our output puts out into the world. But for example, we need the support from the private sector because some part of it comes from new technologies. So we need to be able to provide the right regulatory framework and the incentives for companies to drive the innovation behind clean technologies. What does that mean? As an example, like I mentioned, Costa Rica produces 99% of our electricity from renewable energy. And that can be adopted in other parts of the world, but we need more investment in those technologies, right? To be able to scale them up and to be affordable for countries around the world. Because at the end, when we're talking about economic growth, well, one thing is that more and more is how energy dependent it is. And we want to make sure that that energy is being driven by renewable resources. Otherwise, we won't be able to keep growing without coming to a point saying, well, this levels of growth will deplete our resources and will emit so much emissions that it will be counterproductive. So it's a matter of how a government can be very ambitious in terms of overall vision of development, but how it can understand not only the barriers or the incentives that private companies are seeing on the ground in order to innovate and invest in clean technologies. And I mentioned for energy, but that same with when you talk about transportation, not only vehicles on the ground, but also how about air and freight and water and maritime transportation of cargo and trade around the world. How do we make that sustainable? And that needs, again, technology developments that allow us to make it affordable and make it a business case for companies to start adopting those technologies when it comes to cargo, freight, and the movement of people around the world. And at the same time, we need to understand that I mentioned that there was a moral imperative around sustainability, but also there's a moral imperative of feeding everyone around the world, for people to have access to food and to basic levels of well-being. And that means we have to make sure that agriculture and the way that when we speak about food security, we can't say it's only a matter of making it green for the sake of it. It has to be affordable. It has to be able to allow people to live a life that is meaningful, that what we mentioned before. So we're still in a point in society where many of these questions are still not solved. How can we keep growing in a way that is sustainable, but at the same time inclusive and it reaches everyone around the world, when we still have a lot of people who are undernourished or who are not being able to have the basic living conditions. So it's a very complex situation that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just mentioned the inclusiveness and this sort of, but that's food for another conversation to have about how to make global trade, the global trade infrastructure more inclusive, which is something that in our network we're also very much that we very much care about. So our time is almost up. I want to bring up the poll. Let's see. Do you see Costa Rica's model as a best practice of sustainability of global trade? Question 1. Question 2, will you take action to enforce sustainable practices in global trade in 2022? We should actually make that starting yesterday. And question 3 is, would you support introducing a sustainability measurement tool for World Trade Center members and their business partners? So let's see what the poll will give us. And I'm not allowed to vote in the poll, so...
Me neither.
Yeah.
I'm a little biased on that one.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's see. Give it a minute here. And we've done similar polling, Minister, during our General Assembly also about, does the global trade infrastructure, the way it's set up, WTO context, does it work? And the answer was because again, most of our constituents are the business partners. These are not the multinationals. These are the more medium-sized companies. And the conclusion was no, the global trade infrastructure doesn't work for these companies. It is not inclusive, and there is no voice at the table in those negotiations either. So it was very, very good to hear that feedback from ground up. All right, let's see what the results are of the poll. Well, that's the question one is better than your renewable energy, which is at 99%. 100% sees Costa Rica as a model of best practice. So congratulations. And everyone is going to also take actions to enforce sustainable practices. So I think your message was came home, and this never happened before, where we have all poll questions unanimity here in our network. So would you support introducing a sustainability measurement tool for ourselves and business partners? We seem to have unanimity here as well of participants. I think this is sort of a direct result of what you were mentioning, to create a platform of free trade, free movement of goods for products that actually meet those sustainability standards. So with that, Minister, I want to thank you very much for sharing your story here. Very inspirational, and I'm sure we're gonna continue this conversation in our network. And I very much look forward to, I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. So thank you again also to your team for being available and for sharing the story here with us. Thank you so much. And
thank you very much, Robin, for the invitation. And congrats for the event.
Thank you. And for the participants, please, there will be a link